Looking back on everything that I've done, it's become clear that remakes are now an important part of my channel. I spent so many hours and too much time talking about them, to be honest, whether it be the movies individually themselves or talking of the good and bad that the company has been doing, that I have tried to find a pulse over a range of subjects over a mixed genre that doesn't do anything other than to put content out, where we have just reached a point in time where we have to accept that they exist. That I said, Disney will not stop doing remakes, and it remains to be a business bent on doing the most profitable thing when it comes to entertainment and adapting to the modern times, and this is what they think is best for them, even if we all disagree. So with that knowledge, I've come to terms to accept their existence, but also on the fact that each of the films should be pointed out if they succeed in doing their mission, or affirm to what I think making the worst, misunderstanding every single point of the animated films that they did. Like, I am willing to see most of these films, but only for the fact of critiquing their stupidity on the basis of reality itself, where the films just got less real, ironically enough. Like, when they first started, way back in the 90s with films like 101 Dalmatians to Alice in Cinderella, they did have good designs and concepts with what showed to be a fun version of their initial films, but all it started to shift downhill when they realized it's a good idea to just keep doing it and profiting from it. Lion King being the last straw, in my opinion, of thinking that they should make more. But we still live in a time where people still enjoy these types of films, so Disney would still create them and some can actually enjoy, adapting when they can. But for today, that future of what is to come is actually more in doubt. In a time where Disney is not collapsing, comparing both 2024 and 2023 as up and down years of the scale, but just failing to impress with their films anymore. As you know on this channel, I did not see Snow White at all. I made it a point to actually make a video expressing how upset I've been not only with the film itself, but the atmosphere Disney created with other people around the film where it just wasn't worth to see. That such a film represented the bigger issue with doing any of these types of films, taking away rather than adding or plussing as the older remakes originally did. And if you've been keeping up with the news, Snow White is just literally an absolute dumpster fire, to put it lightly, tracking its box office earnings where it's already projected to lose well over hundreds of millions of dollars, dropping harshly each weekend for such a family film, something that really doesn't happen for a type in the type of story it is. Its failure is just really appalling, and it is the result of them making something that many people were not interested in, regardless of the controversy that you might have seen, where taking one look at the trailer just proves how you shouldn't even watch it on the disservice it does on the dwarves themselves. Which, as you can see, is the main reason I wanted to come back to this and talk about this today, when news came out a few days ago that Disney was putting a hold on the remake of Tango just announced last year. That they're doing this obviously because of how big a failure this movie was, that is only 3 weeks in that the company themselves admit to a rethink of what these films are going to bring. This does not necessarily mean a pause on doing these films at all, but a positive change that could make them realize that they need to change, that they shouldn't be rewarded by making these films until they ran out of ideas, which honestly they wouldn't when they actually make animated films every single year, where it is the right message to send to them, and when they try to go too far in using their films as tools to tell something new, when they simply could just make original movies rather than reimagine something for a new generation, and say what modern times applies to a 100-year-old story. And now for Disney comes the time to talk about their remake future and what they should be doing going forward. Of course, it's not up to me to decide what should happen, that's still their own as a business and I have no real input to what to say, but just to discuss what is likely to happen with what they're doing, to realize what they're doing wrong, and at least make movies entertaining without the added on bonuses that make it much more worse. Of course, this is a case presented in the upcoming Lilo & Stitch film, with something I even talked about on a more positive side, that for the most part, reactions to Stitch's design and the movie as a whole, what was shown, are actually good, which is something we rarely say these days and something I actually am excited for. An odd thing to say as a Lilo & Stitch fan myself, where I would have just hated it for what it is, ripping it to shreds for remaking my beloved classic and probably misunderstanding everything, but with what has been shown so far, it actually doesn't seem too bad and actually makes much more sense in terms of the realism that these films used to have, in the sense that it takes place in the modern present day rather than the fairy tale, where CGI usage is more used. And also the fact that Stitch's original creator and voice actor Chris Sanders is also returning, so that makes things a little bit more better where you got the creator attached to your project, even if it still is a remake of their films that they were involved in, with the fluffy Stitch that still gives hope that they could do something good with these films in a way, you know, giving me hope of a Cinderella type remake, which is more than I could say. Again, not saying anything about stopping completely because they've done well over 2 decades of films and we have to accept it, but how they should only be rewarded for actually entertaining shining properly now, and how most are expecting this to actually be a decent success regardless with those features in, thus making them justified in still continuing, which still means Tango could very well be unpaused, saying that it's more likely that they'll still go on with it depending on what happens here, and also with Moana on track with the rock that it was announced a few years ago before Moana 2 was just put out. So the thing that they will do the most is probably attempt to make the story exactly for what it is, what we should expect in regards to films like Cinderella doing right by its film. That with such a failure of Snow White, they're going to try to steer clear of any of their casting decisions, story decisions, and focus on the good of what it could do, even while disagreeing with it because films like Tangled and Moana brought in the 3D era similar to real life itself, and actually have CG animation that works way better than their last few remakes. It's also a fact where films like Tangled don't really need much work or change since it was pretty modern by the way they portrayed characters like Rapunzel and Eugene that were different and broke the modes of what was to be expected. Things they tried to attempt in a way with films like Beauty and the Beast, The Little Mermaid, and so on, with adapting in a newer era idiotically enough and leading to the failures with things like Snow White. I mean, I do know the original writers are involved with films like Moana, but that's still a remake of a film that comes less than 10 years after the original, and even more jarring only 2 years after the sequel, where it still has a lot more to root against than to succeed, where they can still fail into the same traps that they're still making, but still can't argue with this focus anymore. But these two films also hold a very important key for their upcoming projects if they too would still go ahead as planned or just shut the lid completely, which to that I say is still highly unlikely at this point in time. This is where we have to list what is upcoming so far, things that still have been announced and not been stalled, or delayed or not cancelled as of yet. The first major example involves Hercules, being directed by the same guy who did the Aladdin remake and also produced by the Russo brothers with a modern musical inspired by TikTok, which to me is honestly disgusting hearing, even though I'm getting what they're trying to say in the style of what Hercules did, Vegas and Greece vibes with the flashy tone, where it can either work surprisingly enough or fall flat. It's one of those things where you have to note the mythology of the world and how hard that would be to translate into live action, but still moving forward would be the most interesting thing to see that they could do, which would mostly work on the wacky premise of TikTok musicals, which is much better than what they've done for most of these remakes, just straight up doing whatever that is, and just not sure how exactly that's going to apply in a TikTok sense, since I know and don't know what that's like. Alongside that, there are other films that involve more animals if you couldn't believe, which are the worst decisions that they could still make, but still kept alive by Mufasa's impressive box office run despite not matching what it once was, involving films like The Aristocats, Robin Hood, and Bambi, with The Aristocats being the only film that actually has humans involved. So most of their upcoming projects that haven't been cancelled yet are also ones that involve more of the same non-live action films with the apparent great idea to remake Robin Hood and Bambi, something I think seems dumber than The Lion King itself with what happened in both versions. Like, that's going to be much harder to convince now because they're going into the anthropomorphized form if you've seen those movies, a sort of starting basis to what we would see Disney do with films like Zootopia, going from the medieval to the modern times. And if you make something like that appear to be live action, you're just going to make something that just looks so freaky and awkward, just like the attempted dwarfs themselves. So we could still see on the other hand of their future, they're still not free from making bad decisions still happening, and that's potentially going to sink them even further and probably cap the lid on the remake since they still want this, away from what their princess films did. Again, it all depends on what happens with films like Lilo and Stitch that would determine if these characters would work. That if Stitch can get away with it, then sure, maybe this movie can work to some degree, but we would still have to see. As for the rest like Tangled, they've actually gone into the more unlikely category, just like that Joss Gad produced Hunchback that was stalled for similar reasons of why they could not make a Pocahontas remake no matter what they did. And even more recently, they revealed other projects like Sword in the Stone might not even happen anytime soon, as revealed by its director, where it was intended for Disney Plus anyway, which is more reshuffling news of what is to even come. This also comes alongside the Tiana series that was in the works for Disney Plus, where its director actually wanted to make a remake of Princess and the Frog 2, but how even her series was just shelved because they couldn't get it to where it wanted to be, and the best they could do now is to just turn it into a short special for Disney Plus, which mainly has to do with the fact that Moana 2 was released in the way it was, since they want these projects back into theaters rather than the failure strategy by COVID to make these things on the streaming service and the money they invested into it. I mean, there are so many other spin-off projects and ideas that they have attached to it, but I think it's good to stop here at those ideas to discuss what we do know and that was the least most tangible since it seems they have scaled back greatly due to things like this. That remakes have already reached their peak, and now it's about time of them figuring out what is best for them to do when it comes to their story content and their most ideal realistic films. Maybe along the lines of making Atlantis if remake Lilo and Stitch pops off when it comes out, to those majestic, larger-than-life vibes. That as our end statement, it's just finally time for Disney to stop making the dumb decisions it does and finally put into effort to justify what they want, or with the taste of the audience that has changed dramatically. Where again, they should never reward these lazy attempts at all at making newer versions of the characters, their message and scenery, and just let the people push back to do what is right again. Whether you want them to continue or not, like me, we have certainly reached a positive turning point to what can be expected from their losses. The deserved message of failure for their inability to use what real potential they have instead of complaining constantly like we always do. I mean, the company would move on, and so will we in life, but it's through these decisions that get us to real change for a future that should still be brighter. That we can make an effort on both sides to determine a better path forward, and I know we will. Of course, that probably sounds a little too cheesy and too positive to what we have talked about, but a man can still dream that good things can happen, and they will. The trashier things become, the better we can get served by those who understand, while the ones who didn't fade away into dust. I'm all done. Goodbye.